At the start of October, just weeks before the release of Cities Skylines 2, Colossal Order increased the minimum and recommended requirements for the game. And just 2 weeks later, they released a statement admitting that they had not achieved the performance benchmarks that they had targeted. Further, they expressed a desire to manage expectations on performance while also promising to continually improve the game over the coming months. My guess is right up until the console version is released. While many in the community are appreciative of the transparency, myself included, others are alarmed that their computers may not provide a satisfactory gaming experience. And truth be told, I'm not surprised by these revelations, based on how taxing the game has been on my rig, and it's made me very curious to know how the game will perform on budget and mid-range hardware, considering that most of the community is actually in that range. So thanks to the support of channel members and patrons, I've decided to purchase a variety of hardware to see how the game will perform so that you don't have to guess. I'm hoping that this helps you determine if the game will operate on your existing hardware and help you figure out what kind of upgrade your system might need to play the game. Further, I want to provide some rough settings that should get you off on the right foot right out of the gate. And I do want to make one thing clear. This is applicable to the release version of the game, and I really hope that this video becomes laughably outdated at some point in the near future. Editor Phil here, and I should have been really careful about what I wished for because I woke up on Friday to a new update of the game. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was taken a bit aback by this because I thought that we were working on the final version of the game because that's what we had been told. All of that said, it specifically addresses performance, so I'm not gonna be upset that there's an optimization update that comes our way. And generally, it looks like it's providing a 1 to 5% increase in performance depending on the resolution and the card that you're using. So I have updated all of the charts and tables, and you'll see it reflected in the document that's actually included with this video, so check that out. They'll be highlighted in yellow, the new runs. I ran over 60 new runs on Friday alone, so definitely check those out. But I don't think you should check them out because of the performance update. It's really because of a setting that I changed that dramatically improved performance for most of the cards that I took a look at. So I was sitting here re-benchmarking everything when I got a random YouTube notification pushed to me where the commenter simply recommended that I turn off VSync just to see how things would go. And I thought that's going to be beneficial to the average FPS on the 40 series cards, but probably not much of a help anywhere else, and I was wrong. It actually increased performance for most of the cards I was taking a look at, with the exception of the 20 series cards, oddly enough. It improved the 1% lows significantly. We'll talk about what 1% lows are in just a second, but it dramatically improved the performance and reduced the stuttering for many of the cards. For the 40 series cards in particular, I saw some wild performance improvements. So definitely check out that spreadsheet that's linked in the video description where I have all the test runs, because that's going to be how you can really compare everything. But just reasonably, there's no good way to completely summarize this in this video, so definitely check that out if you want to look at the complete results. And with that out of the way, let's talk about the methodology I'm using to benchmark the systems. To begin, I built a city with a population of approximately 100,000 on the River Delta map, saving at a variety of population milestones. I picked this map because relative to other maps, it lacks weather. I know that weather can have a significant impact on performance and that there is currently not an option to disable the weather visuals, something that I'm personally frustrated by. I don't want non-stop weather or random weather to skew the test results all that much, which is why I've gone with this map. This city that I've created has a little bit of everything, including a dense downtown, some suburbs, an industrial park, harbors and train stations for passengers and cargo alike, and an international airport. I also avoided adding transit outside of taxis to make the traffic simulation a bit more demanding. There's not a specific reason that the city was built to a population of 100,000 outside of being deep into a playthrough, approximately 6 to 7 hours, and at the Metropolis milestone, when you can unlock basically anything you want in the game. I figure for most players, they'd want to have solid performance at this point in the game. I then created this 2-minute camera scene to use for benchmarking. The scene alternates between being close to the action as well as far away for expansive views of the city. It also includes quick camera movements to simulate someone spinning around the map or moving quickly across the city. I've found that the initial pan over the suburban island as well as the zoom into downtown is particularly demanding on the graphics card. So when I talk about stuttering, it's nearly always happening in these two areas. I used MSI Afterburner to benchmark the camera scene against live in-game play to ensure that they were a fair approximation of one another. And after gaining a level of confidence about this, I ran the scene 72 times across a variety of hardware and settings for easy comparison. I'm going to use the terms FPS and 1% lows a lot in this video, so let's cover what they are. I like this definition of FPS from Lenovo, which states that FPS, or frames per second, is a measure at the rate at which a computer video game can produce or render frames. Generally, the higher the FPS number, the smoother and more engaging gameplay will be for users. Cities Skylines 2 is a simulation, so super high FPS is not expected or even beneficial to gameplay. For the sake of this benchmark, we're going to say that 30 FPS is playable, while admitting that sticking closer to 60 is probably more ideal since it will feel much more fluid than 30 FPS. Anything less than 30 FPS can feel stuttery or laggy, particularly if your 1% lows are bad. 1% lows are the lowest frame times produced during 1% of the gameplay session. Ultimately, you want the 1% lows to be as close to the average FPS as possible for the game to feel consistently smooth. It's worth noting that while poor 1% lows can be catastrophic to online shooters such as CS2, for our CS2, it's more annoying than anything else. You can work around it, but if you can avoid it, you'll have a much better gameplay experience. Moving on to the hardware, this is a full list of the CPUs and GPUs that I tested. However, I did not exhaust every possible combination. While benchmarking, trends began to emerge that allow us to extrapolate results and made testing certain combinations of the equipment redundant. Now, before we get to the results, I want to discuss a few caveats about this test. I tested all of the hardware using a modified version of the settings that the game recommended to me. The developers informed early access creators that significant performance gains could be realized by keeping the resolution to 1080p and disabling depth of field and volumetrics. So I've done that for all of these tests. And reasonably, I really think that these settings probably should have been either disabled by default or significantly dialed back, with the ability to manually bump them up to meet your preferences, but I digress. I've also disabled motion blur for accessibility reasons. The setting can cause some people to have motion sickness and headaches, and I don't want that to be the case with this video. It can also cause a slight performance hit, while also having the effect of hiding a bit of stutter, so it's a strange one, but I'm disabling it for now. Let me know how you feel about motion blur down in the comments. Further, there's a setting that allows you to prioritize FPS, simulation speed, or keep it balanced. I've left this setting to balance considering I think that's where most people will probably leave it. However, I did play around with it, and I didn't really see much of a difference to FPS regardless of the setting, for what it's worth. Next, I want to take a moment to talk about this computer, my old Unraid server. It's a Lenovo pre-built from around 2011 that I picked up from a local electronics recycler. I wanted to benchmark this system because it's below the minimum specs for the game, and I did indeed do so. However, I changed the benchmark methodology shortly after the runs to improve replicability. However, I've decided not to retest this system because of just how poor the performance was during the initial tests. These are the results that I got after adding a GTX 970 to the system, the only GPU that would play nice with PCI Gen 2. Interestingly, this is the only system that had a CPU bottleneck, and it averaged only 17 FPS in a city of 50,000. It wasn't a playable experience, so I figured there's not really a point in re-benchmarking it. Speaking of lower end hardware, I want to talk about dynamic resolution, a new setting that's built into Cities Skylines 2. This setting is supposed to help you eke out a couple of extra FPS for machines that are running at very low to medium graphics settings. The feature is horrible, and it ruins the visuals in the game for the sake of gaining 5 to 10% more FPS. Just look at the difference between these two runs. Performance is just about the same, but the run on the right looks a ton better. And though dynamic resolution makes everything look blurry and janky, it is enabled by default, and I've left it enabled for ease of testing. But I beg you, do not enable dynamic resolution. It isn't like the mod of the same name from Cities Skylines, it's basically the opposite, and it isn't worth the FPS game. It's terrible, and honestly, that's a hill that I'm willing to die on. Finally, you'll notice I tested everything at 1080p, only increasing to 1440p and 4K with enthusiast level hardware. Again, this all comes down to performance. The FPS is cut in half at 4K and can even dip below 30 FPS on a 4090. This game is super demanding in its current state and clearly needs further optimization. So with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the benchmarks. I began benchmarking with the Ryzen 5 2600X, which is the minimum requirement for a CPU. I paired it with every card I had except for the 40 series cards, considering that those pairings seemed unlikely. And for the most part, the results were rather unexceptional graphically, but highly playable. Older and budget cards could hit 30 FPS or better on very low settings, while higher end cards, such as the RX 6800 XT and the 3080 Ti, could hit 30 or close to 30 FPS on high settings. 2 points of interest here though. The 3080 Ti was actually more performant on high settings than low settings, and I honestly couldn't figure out why this would be the case, but the 1% lows were basically 10 times better under high settings, with only modest decreases to the average FPS. Second, after testing the RX 6800 XT, I realized that I didn't have resizable bar enabled. Resizable bar allows your CPU to access the entire frame buffer of your GPU at once, rather than in chunks. And in practice, this means a 10% uplift in performance if you have it enabled. And once I enabled that, the performance was more on par with what I had expected, closer to the 3080 Ti. So make sure that you have this setting enabled on your BIOS. Returning to the budget mid-range cards, the 1% lows were absolutely terrible with all of them, with every last one being in the single digits. As I mentioned earlier, this is because of the downtown and suburban island portions of the scene, which caused momentary freezes for many of the cards. Those issues were not as noticeable on the higher-end cards, even when they had their graphics set to high settings. Editor Phil here, and I'm jumping in because this is not actually entirely true if you disable VSync. In fact, if you disable VSync, this is what you will see. I know this is a complicated table, but basically in this table, I've taken each of the cards and I'm displaying their average FPS and their 1% lows based on whether VSync is on or not. The top is with VSync enabled, the bottom is with VSync disabled. The light blue line is the 1% low. The longer that bar is, the more fluid your game seems. So obviously at the very top with the 3080 Ti, things look outstanding. Once you turn off VSync, your 1% low is above 20, which reasonably means it won't feel like you're stuttering at all. Now I know right in the center of the chart, you see the RX 6800 XT, and it looks like I have the charts inverted. I do not. For whatever reason, with the most recent update to Cities Skylines 2, I saw my AMD GPU performance tank. This isn't the first time that the game has struggled with AMD GPUs, so I'm hoping that this gets resolved quickly. Then again, this is the release candidate. That said, they're probably going to update the game rapidly. Hopefully, this isn't a thing that everyone's seeing. Maybe it's just me, but this is what I was seeing. I saw it on a variety of processors with more than one AMD GPU. But even if you go to the bottom and you look at the GTX 1660 Super, you're seeing a very dramatic improvement. And when you get closer to 10 FPS for the 1% low, things aren't going to feel like they're completely stopping, which will make the game a lot more fun to play. And it's significantly better than the almost 0 that we were getting with the 1660 Super when it was on low settings. Popping up to almost 10 is a game changer. It is night and day. All right, let's get back to it. As best as I can tell, poor 1% lows are occurring when you fully exhaust your VRAM, the memory on your graphics card, as well as your system memory or RAM at the exact same time. At that point, you begin to rely on your page file on whatever storage you are using in your system, resulting in stutter and lag. For these tests, I was using a relatively zippy Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe drive, but if you're using a SATA SSD or a hard drive, you're going to have even worse performance than I experienced. So this was the point when I realized just how GPU bound this game is and just how much your VRAM is going to matter. For my tests, cards with 6GB of VRAM or less, such as the 1650, the 1660 Super, and the 2060, will not see an appreciable difference in performance regardless of whether they are paired with a Ryzen 5 2600X or a Ryzen 7 5800X3D, because the GPU is the bottleneck, not the processor. Now, all that flips with cards that have 8GB of VRAM, such as the RX 6600 and the 3060 Ti. For example, the 3060 Ti has improvements in FPS as you work your way through the AM4 CPU product line. However, even with 8GB of VRAM, you'll still see 1% lows that are in the single digits. Editor Phil once again, and this is no longer true with the update to the game. We're seeing significant gains in the 1% lows. I've seen around 20 FPS. Until I turned off VSync, then it got as high as 30, and then things feel buttery smooth. Again, take a look at that table. Lots of changes, specifically to this card. This is probably one of the bigger gainers out of all of the cards that we tested. The 3080 Ti, the 4080, and the 4090, which have 12, 16, and 24GB of VRAM respectively, will all provide you with the ability to play the game at medium and high settings when paired with higher-end processors. They will also provide you with the ability to increase your resolutions to either 1440p or 4K. However, I once again want to remind you, stay clear of 4K. You'll drop up to 50% of your FPS and turn your GPU into a space heater. In fact, after just 30 minutes of playing at 4K with my 4090, my decently sized game room reached a temperature of 87 degrees after starting at 72 degrees. Thank goodness we're entering the cold months. Now, I'd be lying if I didn't admit that this is super disappointing, that basically no current generation card can reliably play the game at 4K high settings. It's a testament to just how much optimization is needed, something it's really easy for non-developer Phil to say. Now, as I was running through these benchmarks, you may have noticed that I didn't mention the Intel Arc A750 or alternative platforms such as the Steam Deck or Mac OS, so let's go over them now. According to Passmark, the Arc A750 is actually weaker than the GTX 970, which is the minimum requirement for Cities Skylines 2. However, that's not why I didn't include it in the benchmarks. I didn't include it because it blue screened my system. And honestly, before the Friday update, it was the only card to do so, but interestingly, now the AMD cards are sometimes giving me a blue screen, and I was able to run the Arc A750 just fine. The performance was more or less on par with the 2060. Now, for the Steam Deck, I launched to an empty map at a consistent 20 FPS with graphical issues. It also ran at 720p, regardless of whether it was docked or not, and you couldn't change it. So in my opinion, this is not playable, and I wouldn't buy the game to play on the system unless your goal is remote play. In that case, all two of you can knock yourself out. Before we move on though, with the update that came on Friday, would you check this out? We've got controller support. This is new, or at least I missed it in the last one, but I don't know why this would be here if they didn't at least anticipate this being able to run on the Steam Deck in the future. It might also mean that they're still working on console support. It's hard to say, but it's interesting to see that it's here. Now, for Mac OS, the game wouldn't boot using crossover and was a slideshow using parallels on a powerful Mac Studio. So as someone that uses a Mac as a daily driver and has a Mac laptop, I really hope the game is compiled for Mac OS at some point in the future. But right now, do not buy it if your goal is to play it on an M1 or M2 Mac. It's just not going to work. And before we move on to my recommended settings, I think it's also important to note that FPS does not scale in a linear way as your city grows. Using my main rig as an example, we'll adjust the settings to 4K high so that we're able to more clearly demonstrate changes in FPS. With a population of approximately 1,000, we're getting 52 FPS. This quickly drops to 34 FPS at 10,000 population, with another steep decline to 28 FPS at 25,000 population. Then things get interesting. We only drop to 27 FPS at 50,000, 25 FPS at 75,000, and finally 24 FPS at 100,000. Now, admittedly, this is a shallow test, but the FPS drop is steepest in the beginning and moderates as your city grows. So I think it's going to be really important to get your settings right in the very beginning. All that said, your results may differ, but I certainly felt this as I played. It's hard to say how this might scale with even larger cities. Moving on to settings recommendations, rather than making recommendations for all cards individually, I think we're able to do so in broad strokes, using the card's price point as an approximation for performance and VRAM. For budget and older cards, start with very low graphical settings and turn off dynamic resolution to improve visuals, which will likely cost you 3 or so FPS. Also, consider increasing the LOD to low to further improve the visuals. If you do that, this is how things will look. For mid-range cards, start with low graphics settings and disable depth of field, volumetrics, and dynamic resolution if you have the overhead to do so. And if you do that, this is how things will look. For mid-range cards with 8GB of VRAM and upper mid-range cards, start with medium settings and adjust the depth of field and volumetrics to low or even turn them off, and turn off dynamic resolution once again, which will again cost you about 3 FPS. I'd also recommend reducing the LOD to low, which will significantly improve the FPS, and if you do that, this is how things will look. And finally, for high-end and enthusiast-level hardware, feel free to start with high settings at 1080p and medium settings at playing at 1440p. I'd still recommend reducing the depth of field and volumetrics to low or even turning them off, and I'd even recommend changing the LOD to low to significantly improve FPS, and in my opinion, it really doesn't change the visual fidelity of the game, and this is how I play on my rig. And don't forget to disable VSync, it's right underneath display mode, and while you're there, why not disable fog too? It makes your game look washed out and eats up FPS for no reason. And if all this has made you realize that you need an upgrade, I have a couple of suggestions. Assuming you already have relatively modern hardware that's just a bit underpowered, the most important upgrade that you can make for Cities Skylines 2 will be your graphics card. Make sure you pick up a card with at least 10GB of VRAM, and honestly, the more the better to future-proof your setup. I think the sweet spot for most people will be a card like the 4060 Ti 16GB, which costs about $450. I was going to also recommend 2 AMD cards, however, with the most recent update to the game that we got on Friday, things broke and the AMD cards have lost performance. So because of that, and because this isn't the first time I've seen issues with AMD cards in this game, I just can't recommend them, even though from a price to performance standpoint, they make a lot more sense. Now, I want to point out that you should steer clear of the 4060 Ti 8GB variant. You can likely find it for $50 to $90 less, but you'll have a card that is significantly less performant today and will likely have a case of stutters now or in the future. Next, I'd consider upgrading your RAM. Make sure you have at least 16GB, the minimum of 8 is absolutely asinine, and I'd recommend shooting for 32GB if possible. And perhaps just as important as the RAM, if you don't already have an NVMe drive, I'd highly recommend that you get one. This will improve the performance of the game generally, as well as when you hit the page file. And the very last thing I'd recommend upgrading is your processor. It's just not as important in Cities Skylines 2 as it was in Cities Skylines 1, as it's almost never the bottleneck. So you won't see huge performance increases unless it's paired with a higher end GPU, which I think you should pick up first anyway. So I know that this was a long and meandering video, and it wasn't quite as clear and to the point as I hoped it would be. Getting the update to the game that I wasn't expecting on Friday certainly played a hand in that. Figuring out the VSync thing was certainly a big thing that modified and changed this video considerably. So please check out the benchmarks. They're linked in the video description. They will help you out a lot to figure out whether the game will run for you or not. If that doesn't do enough for you, I would highly recommend trying the game. So if you've ordered this on Steam, you have 2 hours and you can refund it if it doesn't work for you. If you don't want to go that route, the route I would probably go is just to pick it up on Game Pass. If you're not already a Game Pass member, you can subscribe for 1 month. Sometimes you can find deals, so it's as little as $1. You can try the game out and see if it works. And if you end up wanting to maintain the game, you can buy it through the Microsoft Store with Paradox mods. I assume you're going to be able to have the exact same experience in Game Pass as Steam, and that's probably why they're going to that. So I don't think that you would lose much there, and you get a chance to see if the game actually works for you. So it's certainly disappointing that there's going to be a number of you that day one are going to struggle to get this thing going. Hopefully the settings I provided will help you figure out where to get going. You're going to have to experiment around a lot. The default settings are bad. I don't know why they're that bad. Some of these features to me feel like they shouldn't even be available to the end user, but they are. So just remember, disable all those features: VSync, depth of field, motion blur. All of these things can be disabled and should be disabled. I would get rid of fog too. That'd be another one. Get rid of fog. It's not helpful. It makes your whole game look gray. So if you do that, I've gotten the game to run on a number of cards. I guess just go into this with your eyes wide open. It's a really fun game, but it's really not fun to struggle. And if you can't get it running because of your hardware, the last thing I'd want you to do is feel frustrated by it. So be willing to try it on Game Pass. Be willing to return it if it doesn't work for you. Try these different settings. If you can upgrade a component to get to where you need to be, then great. Otherwise, just you got to be super real with yourself with the performance of this game. And I hope that this gets sorted out sooner rather than later, because one of the things that made Cities Skylines 1 as successful and as fun as it was for so many people is that you could basically run the game on a potato. And that's something that this game is missing. It shouldn't be a game that only people with 4090s and $3,000 rigs can run. That's not what we were looking for in a city builder. And I think Colossal Order knows that. We just gotta wait for them to finish it. I mean, that's what it comes down to. This isn't finished. With that, I think we're going to leave it here. If this was helpful for you, please hit the like button. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. I want to give a huge shout out to every single channel member and patron. Thank you so much for giving me the ability to take time out to do something like this, the financial wherewithal to do this. It's very expensive, very time consuming, and your support has made this video happen. So thank you so much. Everyone, give them all a round of applause. And again, remember to check out that spreadsheet. There's a lot of information there, and I think it will be helpful if you do so. Thank you so much for joining me today. Take care. Bye-bye.